It was late in October when Vice President Kamala Harris found herself deep in the heart of the Midwest, campaigning in small towns that clung to their traditions like leaves that refused to fall. Her team had scheduled an evening event at a centuries-old town hall in a place so remote that it barely appeared on maps. The town was called Maple Hollow, and the stories whispered about it were as old as its cobblestone streets and gnarled trees. The sky was a bruised, swirling gray as her convoy pulled up to the hall. The building was grand but decayed, with ivy crawling over the stone facade and windows that glared like vacant eyes. As Kamala stepped out of the car, the wind carried with it the scent of wet leaves and something sour and musty. She dismissed the unease that gnawed at her, reminding herself that the campaign trail was often grueling and exhaustion played tricks on the mind. Her aides bustled around her, finalizing details and checking security. The townspeople, dressed in weathered coats and boots caked with mud, gathered at the foot of the steps, eager to catch a glimpse of the vice president. Kamala greeted them with her signature smile, her warmth cutting through the chill, and made her way inside the old town hall. The interior was dimly lit, the chandeliers above creaking as they swayed with each gust of wind that managed to seep through the ancient walls. The hardwood floors groaned underfoot, and the walls were lined with portraits of the town's founders, their painted eyes seeming to follow every movement. Kamala couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched not just by the living but by something unseen, something that waited in the shadows. She brushed off the feeling, focusing instead on her speech. The event went as planned, with the usual applause and handshakes. But as the evening wore on and the sky outside darkened to an oppressive, inky black, the atmosphere inside the hall grew heavier. The temperature seemed to drop, and a few of her aides exchanged uneasy glances. Even the townspeople, who had begun the evening with hopeful enthusiasm, seemed more subdued, as if a cold dread had seeped into their bones. Kamala wrapped up her speech and stepped off the podium, but the applause felt thin, muffled, as if the room itself were swallowing the sound. She was shaking hands with the mayor, a wiry man with a lined face and hollow eyes, when she heard it, a low, whispering voice coming from somewhere behind her. She turned, but there was no one there, only the empty space where shadows seemed to pool. "Did you hear that?" she asked the mayor, who gave her a wan smile. "Hear what?" he replied, his voice cracked and tired. "You must be imagining things, Mom. It's just this old place." Kamala tried to smile, but the whisper came again, louder this time and unmistakable. It slithered through the air, weaving around her like a cold breath. "Get out." Her heart skipped a beat, and she pulled back from the mayor, her senses on high alert. The whisper was followed by a loud creak, and one of the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall slammed shut on its own. The crowd fell silent, the tension snapping like a taut wire. An aide hurried to her side, concern etched across his face. "Madam Vice President, are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. Kamala nodded, but her pulse was racing. "I think it's time we wrap things up here," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that had burrowed into her. As her team began to usher her out of the hall, the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping, filling the air with words she couldn't quite make out. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, and she could feel a pressure building, pressing down on her from all sides. She quickened her pace, her security detail closing in around her, but something made her glance back one last time. What she saw nearly made her stumble. The portraits on the walls, the painted faces of the town's founders had changed. Their eyes, once merely paint on canvas, now glowed with an eerie light. Their mouths had twisted into grotesque, open screams, and their hands seemed to reach out from the frames, clawing at the air. Kamala's breath caught in her throat, and she turned away, pushing through the doors and out into the cold night. The air outside felt fresher, cleaner, but her relief was short-lived. The wind howled, carrying with it the sound of church bells tolling in the distance. Her team hurried her to the waiting cars, but as she reached for the door handle, the bells stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Madame Vice President," one of her aides whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Do you see that?" Kamala turned to follow his gaze. Across the street, at the edge of the town square, stood a figure cloaked in shadows. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and wrong, like something that had been twisted and stretched. Its face was obscured, but two pinpricks of red light burned where its eyes should have been. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The townspeople who had gathered to watch her departure seemed frozen in place, their expressions blank and unseeing. The figure raised one skeletal hand, and a gust of wind swept through the square, carrying with it the scent of decay. Kamala's instinct screamed at her to leave, and she didn't hesitate. She climbed into the car, her security detail slamming the doors shut behind her. As the convoy pulled away from Maple Hollow, the figure remained standing, watching, until the town disappeared into the darkness behind them. Kamala sat in the back seat, her hands still trembling, and tried to make sense of what she had just experienced. But the nightmare wasn't over. As the car sped down the winding, tree-lined road that led out of town, the headlights barely piercing the thick fog that had rolled in, the whispers returned. They filled the car, wrapping around her, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Turn back. Come back. Kamala's driver cursed under his breath as the fog thickened, making it nearly impossible to see. The road seemed to twist and turn in ways it shouldn't, and she could feel a rising panic in the air, a tension that pressed down on all of them. Just when it felt like the fog would swallow them whole, the car burst through into clear air, the road straightening out, and the whispers ceased. The rest of the journey was silent, and when they finally reached their next destination, Kamala stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady. She didn't speak of what had happened, not to her aides, not to her security team, but she knew that something had followed her from Maple Hollow, something ancient and dark, something that was not yet done with her. And late that night, as she lay in her hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard the whisper again, faint but unmistakable. "We will meet again." The sun was setting on a quiet stretch of Pennsylvania farmland, painting the sky in dusky oranges and purples, when Vice President Kamala Harris and her campaign team arrived at the historic Ashcroft estate. The estate was a sprawling property built in the late 1800s, famous for its lavish architecture, and as the locals would tell you with a knowing look, a sinister history. The town had eagerly invited Kamala to give a speech about unity and progress, and the campaign trail had led her here, to this picturesque yet undeniably eerie place. The event was set to take place in the estate's grand ballroom, a space with high, vaulted ceilings and large windows that framed the endless fields beyond. The air was cool and carried the scent of autumn, but as Kamala stepped out of the car, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you all right, Madame Vice President?" her aide Marcus asked as he handed her a briefing packet. He was young, with a perpetual look of worry that only intensified when he saw her pause. Kamala smiled at him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she assured him. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the estate was watching her, that unseen eyes lurked in the dark windows of the mansion. She shook it off, attributing it to exhaustion and a long day of travel. The interior of the Ashcroft estate was just as beautiful as it was unsettling. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and antique mirrors lined the walls, reflecting candlelight that flickered with a life of its own. The event had drawn a crowd. The ballroom was filled with townspeople dressed in their Sunday best, murmuring in anticipation as they waited for the vice president to speak. Kamala took the stage, her voice confident and commanding as she spoke about the power of community, about hope and unity. The crowd was engaged, nodding along, clapping at all the right moments. But then, as she was wrapping up her speech, she noticed something strange. One of the chandeliers above her began to sway gently, though there was no breeze in the room. The candles flickered, dimmed, and then without warning the entire room was plunged into darkness. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, and Kamala could hear her security details spring into action, flashlights cutting through the dark. "Stay calm, everyone," she called out, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her gut. But just as the words left her mouth, she heard it, a faint, echoing laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The lights flickered back on, and the ballroom was bathed in an uneasy glow. Kamala's pulse was racing, but she kept her composure, glancing around to reassure herself that everything was back to normal. The crowd, though visibly shaken, was calming down. Her team exchanged wary glances, and Marcus whispered to her, "Let's get you out of here, ma'am." Kamala nodded, stepping away from the podium, but as she moved, her eyes were drawn to the large, ornate mirror on the far wall. For a split second, she saw something in the reflection, a figure standing just behind her, shrouded in shadow. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she knew this was no mere trick of the light. As she and her team made their way through the crowd, apologizing for the disturbance, the laughter came again, louder this time, echoing through the halls. Kamala froze, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Her security detail moved swiftly, forming a protective circle around her, and they hurried her out of the ballroom. Once in the safety of the hallway, she took a moment to steady herself. The corridors of the estate were dark and lined with portraits of the Ashcroft family stern, solemn faces that seemed to watch their every move. Marcus was about to speak when one of the portraits tilted on the wall and fell with a loud crash. The shattered glass scattered across the wooden floor, and the sound echoed through the empty halls. A young staff member, pale and visibly frightened, approached them. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he stammered. This place is old, you know. It does things sometimes." Kamala raised an eyebrow, her politician's mask of calm slipping just a fraction. "Does things?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. The young man hesitated, then leaned in as if he were about to reveal a well-kept secret. "They say this estate is haunted," he whispered. "The Ashcroft family, they died here. All of them. Some say it was a curse. Others say something darker lives here, and it doesn't like being disturbed." Before Kamala could respond, a low moan drifted through the hallway, chilling her to the bone. It was a mournful, anguished sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Her security team tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons, though what they could possibly protect her from, they didn't know. "We need to leave," Marcus said firmly, his face pale. Kamala didn't argue. The team moved quickly, guiding her through the maze-like corridors of the estate, but the shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in on them. The air grew colder, and the mournful moan followed them, echoing through the halls. As they neared the front entrance, Kamala glanced back one last time. Standing at the end of the hallway was a woman dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and waxy, and her mouth was twisted into a silent scream. Kamala's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her heart pounding in terror. The woman didn't move, but her presence was suffocating, oppressive like a weight pressing down on Kamala's chest. Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her away, and the vision of the ghostly woman vanished as they burst through the front doors and into the cool night air. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and scattering dead leaves across the cobblestone path. Kamala was bundled into the car, her security team piling in around her, and as the convoy sped away from the estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The estate loomed behind them, its windows glowing faintly in the moonlight, and just as they turned a corner, she thought she saw the ghostly woman standing on the front steps, her hollow eyes following them into the night. The ride back to their hotel was silent, and Kamala sat stiffly, her mind racing. She had faced some of the toughest challenges in her career, but this was something beyond the realm of politics, beyond reason. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the hotel walls, every rustle of wind outside brought her back to that cursed estate. And as the clock struck midnight, she heard it again, the faint, echoing laugh, as if carried to her on the wind. It was a cold October evening when the wind carried a biting chill, and the sky, despite being full of stars, seemed to swallow light itself. Vice President Kamala Harris, known for her unyielding composure, was scheduled to give a talk at a small university nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. This wasn't an ordinary visit, however. Her appearance had been requested specifically to address a group of students studying the intersection of politics and the supernatural. They had invited her to share an experience she had kept close to her heart, a story that had haunted her for years, but had never made the headlines. The university auditorium was dimly lit, with a few flickering bulbs casting shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the corners. The audience, a collection of curious students and faculty, waited in rapt silence as she approached the podium. The seriousness on her face was palpable, and her usually confident voice held a tremor that was impossible to miss. Taking a steadying breath, Kamala began, "What I'm about to share tonight is something I've never spoken of publicly. It isn't easy for me, and it certainly isn't something I can explain rationally, but I promise you every word is the truth." A hush fell over the crowd, the anticipation so thick it was almost tangible. She clasped her hands together, gazing out into the audience with eyes that seemed to relive a terror that had etched itself into her soul. It happened in 2005, she started, back when I was still serving as the district attorney of San Francisco. One night, I had to travel out of the city to attend a conference in an old, historic town about 2 hours away. My driver had fallen ill at the last moment, and not wanting to miss the event, I decided to make the drive myself. The audience leaned in as she continued. The road to this town, as some of you may know, winds through dense forests and along cliffs that overlook the ocean. That night, the fog rolled in thick, and the moon was barely a sliver in the sky. I found myself gripping the wheel tighter with every mile, my headlights barely cutting through the swirling mist. She paused, her eyes narrowing as if she could still see the memories unfolding. Then, somewhere along the route, my car began to shudder. It was an old model, and though I had taken care of it meticulously, it chose that night, of all nights, to break down. I managed to pull over to the side of the road, my tires crunching over the gravel, and I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Kamala's voice dropped, and the auditorium seemed to grow even quieter. Cell service was non-existent in that area, and it was well past midnight. The forest around me was eerily silent, as though the world itself had paused to watch whatever came next. I remember stepping out of the car, flashlight in hand, and popping the hood. I barely understood the mechanics of a car engine, but I hoped it was something simple, like a loose cable. She let out a humorless laugh. Of course it wasn't. As I leaned over the engine, something moved at the edge of my vision. I snapped my head up, my flashlight slicing through the fog, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Tall, skeletal pines that seemed to close in tighter the longer I looked. Kamala swallowed hard, the audience hanging on her every word. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was just nerves and exhaustion getting the better of me. But then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint I almost missed it. The auditorium's silence was absolute, and even the creaking of the building seemed to hush in reverence. The whisper repeated itself. She said, her eyes wide, "Turn around." A ripple of unease passed through the audience, and Kamala leaned in closer to the microphone. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, my flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the road. Again, there was nothing there. But the whispering continued, louder now, as though a chorus of unseen voices had joined in. "Turn around, turn around." Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the podium. And then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I ran back to the car, slamming the hood shut and locking myself inside. My heart was pounding, and I could barely think straight. But the whispering didn't stop. It echoed inside the car, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The audience collectively held their breath as she paused, her eyes distant. That's when I saw it. In my rearview mirror, through the fog, a figure appeared. It stood in the middle of the road, draped in a tattered, black cloak. Its face was pale and hollow, eyes like twin voids. But what terrified me most was how still it stood, as if it were waiting for me. Kamala's voice trembled. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure began to raise one hand, long, bony fingers reaching out. And then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. She exhaled, as though the memory itself had suffocated her. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Eventually, the whispers faded, and the fog began to clear. My car, miraculously, roared to life when I turned the key, and I sped away from that place, not daring to look back. Kamala glanced around the room, her expression grave. When I finally reached the town, I told a local police officer about what I'd seen. His face went pale, and he told me a story I'll never forget. He said that stretch of road had once been the site of a terrible accident, a carriage crash over a century ago. Many souls had perished, and some believed they never left, wandering the woods and whispering to lost travelers. A cold silence blanketed the audience as she finished. I don't know if what I experienced was real or some trick of my mind, but one thing is certain, the memory still haunts me, and I'll never forget those whispers. Turn around. Kamala stepped back from the podium, the echo of her words lingering long after she finished speaking. The audience sat in stunned silence, the chill of the story settling into their bones. The sky was a canvas painted with bruised shades of dusk when Vice President Kamala Harris found herself in a remote part of Maine. She had been invited to speak at a prestigious private school known for its old, Gothic architecture and whispered tales of hauntings that stretched back generations. The school had requested that, instead of a traditional political speech, she share something personal, a chilling experience that had long lain dormant in the corners of her mind. The grand auditorium was packed with students and faculty, the ornate chandeliers casting long skeletal shadows across the crimson walls. The air seemed thick, charged with an electric tension as Kamala approached the podium. She took a moment to compose herself, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "There's something about this place," she began, her voice steady but carrying an underlying note of apprehension, "that reminds me of a night I'd rather forget." The murmurs in the room quieted, the audience now entirely focused on her. Kamala's eyes clouded with memory. It was many years ago, back when I was an assistant district attorney in Alameda County. A friend of mine, Rebecca, had recently purchased an old, abandoned house in the hills, hoping to renovate it into a bed and breakfast. The house was rumored to be haunted, but Rebecca didn't believe in such things. She invited me, along with a few mutual friends, to spend a night there and chase away the ghosts with laughter and good company. Kamala's lips pressed into a thin smile. I'll admit, I went more out of curiosity than anything else. The house, perched atop a lonely hill, was as foreboding as the legends claimed. Its windows were dark, gaping mouths, and ivy strangled the stone walls. We arrived just as the last light of day bled into the horizon, our laughter echoing too loudly, too nervously. Her voice dropped, drawing the audience in. The interior was a maze of shadows. Creaking wooden floors, peeling wallpaper, and antique furniture draped in dusty sheets filled every room. Rebecca was determined to make the night fun, so we played board games in the parlor and sipped wine, trying to ignore the unsettling noises coming from the house, the distant sound of footsteps, the faint creak of doors opening and closing. Kamala took a sip of water, her hand trembling just slightly. At some point, one of our friends suggested exploring the basement. I hesitated, but Rebecca was insistent. She had heard that the house had a labyrinth of tunnels beneath it, used during Prohibition to hide bootlicker. Intrigued, we gathered flashlights and descended the creaking stairs into the darkness. Her voice grew quiet, the silence in the auditorium amplifying the tension. The air down there was heavy, damp, and carried the scent of decay. Our flashlights swept over old wine barrels and rusted tools, but there was nothing particularly unusual at first. We laughed at our own fears, our voices echoing off the stone walls. But then, as we made our way deeper into the basement, things took a sinister turn. Kamala paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I remember the moment vividly. My flashlight flickered, and for a heartbeat, everything went dark. When the light returned, I saw something I can never unsee. At the far end of the room stood a figure, cloaked in shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were two glowing pinpricks of light. The audience was dead silent, some leaning forward in their seats. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and heavy, pressing down on me. My friends were still laughing, unaware of the terror that had frozen me in place. But then Rebecca's flashlight caught the figure, and her laughter died in her throat. Kamala's grip on the podium tightened. We ran. We didn't think, speak. We just ran back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind us. Our laughter had dissolved into shaky silence, and we could barely catch our breath. Rebecca tried to brush it off, said it was probably just our imagination, a trick of the light. Her voice grew somber, but the house wasn't done with us yet. That night, as we tried to sleep in the upstairs bedrooms, the whispering began. A low, rhythmic chant that seemed to seep through the walls. Come down, come down. Over and over, the words twisted and coiled in the darkness, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the house itself wanted us back in the basement. Kamala's eyes darkened. No one slept that night. By dawn, we were packing our things, ready to leave that cursed place. Rebecca sold the house soon after, admitting she had felt watched ever since our visit. The new owners tried to renovate it but abandoned the project, claiming the house was alive. The tension in the room was palpable, and Kamala leaned in. I've faced some truly terrifying things in my career, but that house remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. To this day, I can still hear that chant if I think too long about it. Come down, come down. She straightened, her demeanor returning to its usual calm, but the memory still lingered, hanging heavy in the air. Perhaps it was just our minds playing tricks. Or maybe some places are simply wrong, twisted by the past into something dark and malevolent. Either way, I don't plan on ever going back. The auditorium erupted in nervous applause, the audience visibly shaken by her tale. As Kamala left the podium, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed just a little bit deeper, and the chill of her story stayed long after she had finished speaking. It was the middle of a stormy night, and Vice President Kamala Harris sat comfortably on the plush leather seat of her government plane. She had been returning from an important diplomatic visit, her team exhausted and most of them fast asleep, as rain lashed against the windows and turbulence jostled the plane. Kamala was never one to let storms rattle her, but that night, a sense of unease had settled in the pit of her stomach, gnawing at her nerves in a way she couldn't shake. She adjusted her reading glasses and tried to focus on the stack of papers in front of her, but a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed by an unnerving rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very metal of the plane. The lights flickered briefly, and she glanced up, her heart pounding a little harder than she cared to admit. "Rough night," she murmured to one of her security officers, who nodded from his post nearby. The officer smiled, but it was thin, strained. "Yes, ma'am, but we'll be fine. These planes are built to handle anything." Kamala tried to smile back, but her unease only grew. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something off. Something about the storm, the way it seemed to wrap around the plane, felt almost personal. Just as she was about to push the feeling aside and get back to work, the plane gave another lurch, and the lights flickered again. This time they went out completely for a long, suffocating moment. The cabin was bathed in total darkness, and Kamala could hear the collective gasp of the staff who had been jolted awake. When the lights finally returned, Kamala's breath caught in her throat. The cabin was silent, but something had changed. A cold draft swept through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. She shivered, pulling her blazer tighter around her shoulders, and looked around. At first, everything seemed normal, her team slowly calming themselves after the scare. But then, her eyes drifted toward the back of the plane. There, standing in the aisle, was a figure she hadn't seen before. It was a tall man dressed in an old-fashioned pilot's uniform, the kind worn decades ago. His cap was slightly askew, and his face was pale and drawn, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim cabin light. His gaze was empty, cold, as though he were looking through everything and everything. "Who?" Kamala whispered, her voice catching. No one else seemed to notice the man standing there, not even the security officers. The ghostly pilot turned his head slowly, almost mechanically, until his eyes locked onto Kamala. She felt a chill race down her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a garbled, static-like sound that made her teeth ache. Kamala's instinct was to call out, to alert someone, anyone, but before she could even draw a breath, the man disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, like a candle being snuffed out. Kamala sat frozen, her heart thundering, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. She scanned the cabin, searching for any sign of him, but there was nothing. It was as though he had never been there. Shaking her head, she tried to convince herself that it had to be a trick of the light or her own exhaustion playing with her mind. But then, a voice crackled over the plane's intercom. It was the pilot, his voice steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Kamala exhaled, trying to calm herself. She leaned back in her seat, only to freeze when she felt something cold and wet against her neck. Slowly, she raised her hand and touched the spot. Her fingers came away damp, and she looked down to see dark, oily residue smeared across them. Before she could react, another flicker of lightning illuminated the cabin, and in that flash, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Pressed against the window beside her, staring in from the storm-tossed darkness, was a face. It was twisted and pale, with wide, unblinking eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque, silent scream. Raindrops streaked over the ghostly features, and then, just like before, it was gone. Kamala clamped a hand over her mouth, struggling to keep herself from screaming. Her security officer noticed her distress and stepped forward, concern etched across his face. "Madam Vice President, are you all right?" She struggled to find her voice, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I think I need some air. Just a moment." He nodded, though confusion flickered across his expression. Kamala unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. She made her way toward the back of the plane, where the strange figure had appeared, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Reaching the small kitchenette area at the rear of the cabin, she gripped the counter, taking deep breaths. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel surface of a cabinet, but then her stomach twisted with dread. There, in the reflection, stood the ghostly pilot. He was right behind her. Kamala spun around, but the kitchenette was empty. The pilot was gone, yet the air still felt thick, suffocating. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, hoping to distract herself, but the screen wouldn't turn on. It was as if the storm itself had trapped her, isolated her from everything. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the cabin, the plane shuddering violently. Kamala stumbled, grabbing onto the counter to steady herself, and she heard something behind her, a whisper, low, guttural, and soaked with sorrow. "Help us." She turned, her heart pounding, and saw shadowy figures beginning to form in the mist that had inexplicably filled the back of the plane. There were men, women, even children, their faces twisted in pain and fear. They reached out toward her, their voices a chorus of desperation. "Help us," they whispered again, the words weaving around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. Before she could respond, the mist thickened, swallowing the apparitions whole. Kamala stumbled back into the main cabin, the lights flickering once more. Her team stared at her, confusion and worry in their eyes. "Madame Vice President," one of her aides asked, "are you feeling all right?" She opened her mouth to speak but was interrupted by the intercom crackling to life again. This time, the pilot's voice was different, older, laced with static and desperation. "We never made it home," the voice rasped. "We never made it back." The lights surged, then stabilized. Kamala stood there, shaken and pale, and the plane finally broke free of the storm's grasp, the turbulence easing as if a great weight had lifted. No one else heard that last, ghostly message. No one but Kamala, who returned to her seat, her mind racing with questions and fear. As the plane descended toward its destination, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had glimpsed something she was never meant to see, an echo of a tragedy trapped in the skies, forever searching for a way home.